Do you think life is simpler as time evolves? For some, it can be more complicated when facing issues about health, estate plans, probate, long-term care, and more. That's why attorney CPA Joe Cordell hosts ElderTalk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of ElderTalk. As has been our habit of recent months, we want to focus on healthcare issues. We know that our audience, who for the most part are in the last third of their life, the best third of their life, among the things that we find that you think about, dare I say obsess about, is health. And why wouldn't you? I mean, we're in the middle of a COVID-19. This only occurs once every 100 years. Is a 100-year flood of a virus. So we want to continue giving you access to the best advice, the best ideas, the best developments occurring in this area. And among the things that perhaps has frustrated all of us as much as perhaps the direct health issues themselves is, what is the best strategy for conducting our lives during the course of this? And this is a life or death question for people above 60, Jill.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, we can.
They're the ones that are most impacted by this.
Yeah, and they're the ones who don't arguably have a second chance, depending on how badly things may go if they don't get this right. Whereas, we can philosophize if you're in your 30s, 40s, or whatnot. This can be kind of an interesting discussion without great consequence. But for those especially in our audience, this is a life or death decision, and they're determined to get it right. And that's to what extent should they be sequestered in their house and assure that they're perfectly quarantined from any potential virus versus living a life in which they come out more and they do more things, cautiously, of course. And this is a big question, but more than a question for any of you individual listening, this is also a question that is an economic question. It's a national question. It relates to our health and our success and our financial well-being as a nation. What we're going to talk about today goes to the very heart of this discussion, and it represents what I think would be the most credible alternative view to what you're probably hearing from many of the institutional voices in America. I think it would be the predominant institutional view would probably contrast with this. We'll get opinion from our guest here. But Jill, being the wonderful producer that she is, she manages to identify, to gain access to this celebrity. This person, though, who is an author of what is called the Great Barrington Declaration, a prominent physician from Stanford University who is here today to talk to us about this very question: how best should we be and how should we conduct our lives during the course of this pandemic?
And we have Dr. J. Bhattacharya. We are so excited to have you on the show to talk about this. Welcome to the ElderTalk show. And I want to start off, tell us the purpose, the motivation behind the Great Barrington Declaration and exactly what went into creating it.
Sure. So the basic idea of the Great Barrington Declaration is a call to return to traditional public health principles for dealing with an epidemic like COVID-19. In many ways, the lockdowns that we've experienced are a vast departure from normal public health principles that have worked successfully with epidemics for almost a century. And the key scientific fact, and you mentioned it, is that the disease is much more deadly for people who are older than people who are younger. So, for instance, for people who are over 70, the survival rate, if you get infected, is about 95%. Whereas for people who are under 70, the survival rate is 99.95%. Orders of magnitude higher survival rate, 95 versus 99.95.
Well, yeah, and that falls in line. You can look on any health department website in the country, and it states the recovery rates. And the recovery rates are all very, very high.
Yeah, I mean, they're high, but I mean, still 5% mortality is a significant risk for older. I have an 80-year-old mother, and I don't want her facing a 5% mortality risk if it's avoidable.
It's a 1 in 20 shot. If you think about it, some things we would think those are great odds, but not when it's life or death.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I think the key thing then is we have to take these facts seriously. For younger people, as you said in your introduction, an excellent introduction, this is something to take seriously, but it's also something that you have to consider against all the other things that you do in your life. And the lockdowns have been devastating for younger people. Just for instance, in June, the CDC did a survey. Turns out that 1 in 4 young adults, age 18 to 24, seriously considered suicide this past June in the United States. 1 in 4. And people have delayed going to get cancer treatments, actually avoided them getting them altogether.
I know those examples personally, people who've died because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what's the principle there? Well, public health shouldn't be thinking about a single disease to manage. It should be managing all of people's health holistically. We should be thinking about those trade-offs, because it's not just a trade-off of economy versus health for COVID-19. We're not just vectors of infection to one another. There's a whole, we're human and we have many, many needs that public health people need to think about. And for younger people, the lockdowns have been devastating. On net, I think the lockdowns have harmed the younger population. I mean, I'm talking under 70, very, very substantially, and in ways that I think are avoidable. Whereas at the same time, for the older population, we have not done an excellent job, especially early in the epidemic, but still, in protecting the vulnerable, protecting the older population, and providing them with the information and resources they need to stay protected. So what is the Great Barrington Declaration? What's motivated? It's those observations. It's a call to return to public health principles, so we better protect the vulnerable. And for the younger population, we acknowledge that the lockdowns have been worse than COVID-19, and we let them get on with their lives, obviously taking precautions as they see fit. This is all voluntary, but without the kind of one-size-fits-all lockdowns that characterized American healthcare policy in the last few months.
So how did this Great Barrington Declaration then come about?
So I'm a professor of medicine at Stanford. I had been talking with Professor Martin Kulldorff, who's an epidemiologist at Harvard University, and we come from slightly different backgrounds. I'm a health economist by training, although I've done infectious disease epidemiological work and policy for the last 20 years. Martin's a biostatistician by training, but also done vaccine safety and other epidemiologic work. And I'd also been following Professor Sunetra Gupta of Oxford's work. It was clear that we had been thinking along the same lines. Professor Kulldorff organized this meeting in Great Barrington, which is a town in western Massachusetts, for the three of us. We got together, and we realized we really had been thinking along the same lines, even though we were coming from different points of view. And that's how it came about. So it's like, what's the right thing to do given the science that we're seeing? And that's the genesis of the Great Barrington Declaration.
And the Great Barrington, how long a document is it? Is it just a few bullet points?
It's a page. It's a page. It's not meant to be a detailed scientific treatise, a white paper. It's aimed at changing the way we think about this, managing this epidemic. And it's not meant for us as scientists alone. It's meant for the public at large to see. Because I think a lot of the problems with public health in this epidemic and scientists in the epidemic is that we've sort of taken it on ourselves as if we were essentially the dictators of the country, when in fact every single person's life is affected by these decisions. The people should have a voice and a clear articulation of what ideas are underlying these policies, and that's the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration.
Doctor, a friend of mine who is a therapist said something, and it was so eloquent. She said, when you instill fear in people, then you're able to control. What is your response to that? Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the principles that I learned in public health is you should not instill fear. We should convey accurate information so that people can make correct decisions, the decisions that they would, they can take into account their values without fear. I've given you the numbers. Those are the numbers from the scientific literature on the mortality rate. Should you fear 5%? I think different people react to 5% differently, right? Should you fear 0.05%? Well, people fear different. People react very differently depending on those numbers. But those are reactions grounded in knowledge rather than fear. I think one of the consequences of fear is that, in fact, what's happened is that older people actually underestimate their risk, I think. That's what surveys have suggested relative to what it actually is. And younger people have overestimated. We've given this impression of a one-size-fits-all epidemic when it's not.
Yeah, and instead, though, there seem to be strenuous efforts to remind us that little kids are going to get it or very easily can get it in the face of evidence that's suggesting it's so improbable and so extraordinary. But it seems that the effort is made on the part of those who are the arbiters of this information to make clear that we're all at risk. Nobody's safe. And you just wonder what positive public policy is served by that approach, and the willingness to be dismissive about the consequences of economic hardship and bankruptcies and unemployment vis-a-vis human health. I'm among those who, perhaps you can tell, are sympathetic with an approach, that is more nuanced and is intended to target specifically those that are at risk. Can you summarize then what your prescription is? You kind of gave an overview of it a few moments ago, but what is the prescription that's being offered in the Great Barrington Declaration? Is there any specificity in this one-page document?
Let me describe, for instance, the nuanced way you address the vulnerable people. So that depends on where they live, right? So in nursing homes, we should do everything imaginable to make sure that nursing home residents are not exposed to this virus. That's where a very large fraction, unfortunately, of the death from this virus has happened, and we need to do better at that. I think we kind of have some states that started to do better than others, but we should use all our resources. We should our testing resources so that staff members are tested if they're not immune to the virus before they work. We should reduce staff rotations so that each person only interfaces with each resident only interfaces with a few people. Family and friends, actually, it's really important that they be allowed to visit, because people are lonely. Older people gets really, that's part of health in those nursing home settings. But at the same time, we should be testing people with these rapid tests so to make sure that they're not net positive when they come in. We should do everything we can possibly can to make sure those nursing homes are locked out. Like if someone is positive, either have a place where they can be where they're not going to be interacting with other people who are positive or negative, I think those kinds of ideas have been actually put in place in many nursing homes around the country, and I think making those basically mandatory everywhere, that's really critical. Another thing for people living at home, older people living at home, we have these days hours when only older people are allowed into the groceries, right? So, but we can do better than that. We can offer home delivery of groceries, for instance, to older people when there's high community spread. A real problem is when older people are living in a multi-generational home with younger people. There's a lot of tension there sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. The younger person sometimes gets blamed because they're living their life normally and potentially can expose the older person. Actually, it's interesting. The lockdowns have helped cause that by creating bankruptcies, lost jobs. They've sent a lot of young people to go live with older relatives. I think ending the lockdown could partly help reduce that problem. But also you could think of, again, creative ways to address that. So if there's high community spread or someone's been exposed in the home, maybe we offer, we offer hotels to homeless people during this epidemic. Well, we could offer alternative voluntary living arrangements for a short time when someone in the house is exposed, a younger person's exposed to the virus, and the older person is doesn't want to be around there. Then we offer offer alternative living arrangements, or maybe they can go offer ways to live with other family members, older family members or friends for a short time. I think those kind of creative ideas would help protect the vulnerable. That's in nursing home settings. There's one other really important setting where I think we've done a very poor job, and that is older people who are in the workforce. Essential workers. We sometimes call them essential. Grocery clerks or bus drivers. We've asked them to be exposed to the virus, even though we know they're at risk. We've basically given them a choice: either be exposed to the virus or lose your livelihood, lose your ability to feed your family, lose your ability to take care of yourself. I think that is a absolutely terrible policy that we have not thought about how to protect those vulnerable people in the working class. So we call for all of those things. For the rest of society, for whom the harms from the lockdown, the psychological, mental, economic, all these costs from the lockdown are worse than the COVID risk, well, the Barrington Declaration says, let's set us free. Let us do what we would normally do. Now, that's not to say that don't take precautions. Of course, people, if they feel uncomfortable, are not required to go out. They're not required to do anything. I mean, the issue is if the cost of the lockdown is worse for you, well, why should public health be forcing you to pay that cost? It's not protecting the vulnerable. I mean, as you can see, we've had 220,000 deaths with this policy of lockdown. So basically, it's a call to abandon that policy for the non-vulnerable and intensify the policy in more intelligent ways for the vulnerable.
You know, Doctor, I have no formal medical training. I know just enough to be dangerous, but what you're saying does make sense to me. And what has just been loud and clear for many in the medical community, again, getting back to the fear, if you don't wear a mask, if you don't stay home, you're going to die or you're going to kill people.
And what has I guess stood out most to me as I look at all this and over the past 8 months or so, and I know that this is a medical discussion, not a political discussion, but I think it's unavoidable to conflate the two to some extent, because I think there is a political dimension here, sadly, when it should be entirely about good medical decisions. But if we'd been having a conversation in November, and you were to pose a hypothetical in which there's this pandemic and you have these rules in place and who would be likely to follow and who wouldn't, I would have thought that this sort of law and order, more politically conservative group would have been the ones who would be advocating the law and order and compliance, and the more bohemian, liberals, who would be defiant in the face of these orders, et cetera. So I've watched with interest from a social psychology standpoint how this has unfolded, and I'm afraid that it's manifested itself in medical policy, and that's that it turns out that political conservatives, again, just speaking with a very broad brush here, in larger numbers tend to be offended and resistant to these what they would call intrusions on their lives, and then liberals, who I thought would have been the most
rebellious.
Rebellious, that's the word. Thank you. The rebellious, and they enthusiastically embrace this, and you get a sense that it's gone beyond medicine. I was in Asheville, North Carolina. I was going up to it's a vegan restaurant. They just you could take things out, and there was a big plexiglass screen there where the door opens up, right? So all you see is this plexiglass, kind of like you're in a bad neighborhood in a convenience store. And so I go up to this plexiglass, and there's just a little opening at the bottom to pass money and to sign credit card receipt or whatever. And this woman says to me when she sees I don't have a face mask, she steps back from the plexiglass. She steps back and says, "I'm sorry, you can't approach this until you have a mask on. I'm sorry." And so she seemed, alarmed. And I thought to myself, this is not about health. This is something more. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's definitely not just about health.
Yeah.
And you could conclude, as you just suggested, Doctor, that she's one of these young people who have this, this irrational fear. Or you could conclude that, well, really, it's maybe not about fear, and it's maybe not about even health. Maybe it's about, this great social project. We have this project that is being ran from this government, and we should all be cooperative and compliant, and we can trust government to have policies that will protect us, and we should all be happy to submit. This is a little bit of a harangue, Dr. Bhattacharya, but do you feel there is at least whatever your political views, do you believe that there is a political dimension to this whole policy?
You also have raised a whole host of really interesting issues. Let me start by framing the answer in terms of traditional public health principles. First, Jill, you mentioned the shaming of people who have the disease. I've seen that firsthand. We blame people. Oh, you lapsed. That's why you got it. That is a violation of every single public health principle. I mean, we never should shame people who have a disease. We
Right.
did this with HIV, and it was an enormous mistake.
Yes.
That needs to stop, and public health needs to acknowledge its role in creating that narrative. It hurts people when they're at the most vulnerable, when they're actually sick. It makes no sense, and it doesn't actually help reduce the spread of the disease. It's just punitive for no purpose. We need to be stopping that message from spreading. We should have a counter message like, look, we should be compassionate for people who get sick, not shame them. As far as like the politics, the politics are interesting because it's so different in different countries. So the UK, the Conservative government, is very, very strongly in favor of lockdowns. The anti-lockdowns movement, to the extent it exists, is actually drawn from people both inside the Conservative government and the Labour government.
But they didn't start out that way, did they?
Yeah, no, they started out with more like much closer to the Great Barrington approach, but they moved very quickly to these lockdowns, and now they've doubled down on them. The socialist government, the Social Democrats in Sweden, which no one would consider conservative, they're very strongly against these lockdowns. They've had a much closer to this focused protection approach. Some failures are in March in protecting nursing homes, but since then, very close to this. It's a strange kind of politics. What I've seen is that the traditional political labels don't actually seem to apply here. I could characterize me as center right. I mean, I don't particularly care about my politics that much. I've spent my life writing pieces that I hope people pick up, whatever their politics, and people on the left have picked up my work and people on the right have picked up my work, and I'm equally happy when that happens. The other folks who I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with, I'm pretty sure they're the left of me, but I just don't care about their politics. What unites us is a desire to return to traditional public health principles, to deal with this epidemic more humanely, more morally than we have been. And actually, let me just return to the specific question you asked about politics. To me, that also points to another failure of public health. Public health should unite. It should never divide along political lines. When it divides along political lines, it undermines its own authority with a substantial part of the population. And public health officials shouldn't be surprised when they do that people won't comply. Like take masks, for instance, that the fact that it's a partisan issue is a evidence of a failure of the public health messaging around this. Whether you agree or disagree with the mask use, the evidence for that, I mean, that's a separate question. Just the fact that it is a political issue at all is evidence that public does something gone very, very wrong in public health.
Well, and do you think, though, that I guess economists would use the word a secular factor or a secular trend in the United States as we in particular have experienced this, and this might explain the fact that you have this odd alignment, if there is in fact an alignment politically regarding these issues, is that we have somebody in office, a figure Trump, and whether you like Trump or not, even people who like Trump would say that whether he's alienated people or people are alienated from him, the fact is that this came along at a time when we had a president against whom there was so much resistance on everything, that whenever he in fact chose a side, then he determined what the side would be that others would choose. And the others, it turns out, are the people in all of the institutions that we respect, including media, academia, government, and so he chose a particular position, and I think to some extent because of the alienation or whatnot that existed before the virus came along, the virus found an environment, or it stumbled upon an environment in which whatever the president did, you can be sure that these other institutions will do the antithesis. So that may explain in and of itself a substantial amount of the acrimony on this whole subject. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that certainly in the United States it explains quite a bit. I mean, I think we were in many ways divided before the virus, and the virus just intensified those divisions in ways that should be evident to every single American, which is, I mean, very, very unfortunate, right? I mean, I think we would do better to view the virus as the common enemy as opposed to each other as an enemy. And I think the polarization around of opinion around President Trump, I think, has certainly contributed to this division. I hope it heals.
So then, to what country, if there is a country, that would you point to say this is the closest example I can find of a policy that reflects the Great Barrington Declaration? Is there a country to which you can point?
Yeah, I'd point. I mean, Sweden is probably post-March Sweden. In March, I don't think they did a good job protecting their nursing homes in Stockholm. But after that, they did a much better job. And you can see that the proportion who died that are older is lower in Sweden than in other places. And they also have lower total excess deaths. So in a sense, the younger population was protected from the harms of the lockdown because they essentially followed this focused protection policy. Actually, funny enough, Japan has had a relatively relaxed policy, and that's in that sense among the younger, while still protecting its older. They've had a very low death rate, despite the fact that they have a very, very high proportion of older people. So I think maybe Japan. In the United States, I think Florida has come sort of closest, or South Dakota has come sort of closest to these ideas. I don't think there's a perfect example anywhere in the world of this, but you have to lead with an idea. And the idea has some abstract notions to it, but when you put it in practice, it's always going to encounter some. Always have to amend it somehow, right? But you have to first start with the idea, and the goal of the Great Barrington Declaration is to change our idea for what to do with this epidemic.
Doctor, getting back to the shaming, a lot of people say they're fearful of taking the vaccine because they don't know the long-term effects and other issues. Do you think that there will be a second wave of shaming for those who don't take the vaccine?
Well, and even putting it differently, I don't want to load that question. I like the question, but it might be that people would argue that this is something that people need to take, that a libertarian, even a good libertarian, cannot say that someone can in isolation choose to not take a vaccine when the consequences are great for others. So I didn't want to load that too much, Doctor, in terms of suggesting that people should be at liberty. I'm not taking a position on this, but I'm curious about your position, and I don't want to influence it.
Well, I think it depends on what the data actually show about the vaccine, which we don't know yet, right? How safe is it? How effective is it at preventing you from getting infected? How long lasting will the immunity last? All of that really matters into answering that question. I'd say this: I think we have seen the politicization of the vaccine even before it's out in a way that's really distressing to me. You're seeing a partisan divide in uptake of the vaccine based on, I think I heard one of Harris, Vice President candidate Harris, say that she wouldn't take the vaccine if only the Trump administration FDA had evaluated it.
Yeah, I heard that.
Right.
I mean, I work with these FDA scientists. They're incredibly careful scientists, and they will not let a vaccine through if it's not safe, if there's any indication of it's not safe. I mean, that actually personally hurt. So I don't think that we should politicize this issue. This is going to come down in some sense to the science. It's extraordinary that we have made this effort to get these vaccines out. Let's look at what the data actually end up showing after careful evaluation is done, and then decide how best to use the vaccines. If it comes and if there's a safe and effective vaccine, it'll be a great boon, a great thing for everybody, I think. But in the meantime, let's do these focused protection ideas.
But I do think it's going to be interesting what percent of the population refuses to take it. And irrespective of the results of the studies, there are just people who are constitutionally or philosophically opposed to vaccines.
We'll just take a hypothetical, right? So let's say there's a vaccine with a 1% serious adverse event risk for children. Do I want to expose my children to that vaccine when getting infected with the virus itself has a 99.95 survival rate for children?
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't want that. Now, if it's a very, very close to 0% serious adverse event rate, then and 100% effectiveness or a really high effectiveness rate, then yeah, then I might, then I think it would make sense. I think we don't want to ask people to take too large of a risk for themselves with the idea that you help the population at large. I mean, that's really the problem with the lockdowns in young people. We're essentially saying, take this huge harm to yourself, even though that is the lockdown harm, without like any concomitant benefit. It's going to create social strife. I think we can revisit. Why don't we revisit this after we see what the data from the vaccines actually end up showing? Because that'll determine, I think, the right approach to it.
You raise a point that I hadn't thought about, would be that you even if you have an adverse rate that is very improbable, but yet is more probable than that of getting a serious illness from the disease itself. So one might conclude that they didn't want their child to have a vaccine. And incidentally, the risks that were identified, you've got to add something to that for the unknown, because things that people just generally suspect about vaccines. Then suddenly you're in a debate with the school administration and maybe other parents who are saying, yeah, but you have a duty to give this to your kid anyway because your kid might give the virus to my kid who gives it to his grandmother. I can just see where you can have some civil liberties issues come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that with the flu, right? Or we certainly see that with MMR vaccine because of this false study that argued there's some link to autism, which there isn't. You know, there's some element of that. When you take a vaccine, you are obviously protecting yourself from the disease, but you're also protecting others. So there's some element of this, what economists would call an externality, a positive externality. And that needs to be weighed against the risk that people face from the vaccine themselves. Public health, a good public health system where people have trust in it would be able to convey those risks adequately and treat people like, informed citizens, as opposed to like a diktat from above. I think it's going to be difficult because the public health environment created around this COVID crisis in the United States and actually a lot of places hasn't engendered that kind of trust.
Yeah, I agree, especially when we've seen the CDC distorted the numbers, several months back. Also with health organizations releasing false positive results of people that have COVID. And, having said all of that, I don't think a lot of people have trust in the health community because of all of this.
I think you're right. I think we're going to need to work very hard to restore that trust. I mean, I don't know how to do it other than to tell people what I'm seeing in the data as accurately as I possibly can, and then trusting people to make decisions that are right for them. I think the lockdowns themselves actually have created that mistrust. We've told people the lockdown is the only way to deal with this when it's not the only way to deal with this. We tell people stay home. We created this panic. We created shame. We've done all kinds of things that you would not learn how to do in a public health. If you took Public Health 101, these would not be in the tool book. It wouldn't be in the textbook. We have to get back to traditional public health management of this, the traditional public health principles. Those principles work. They engender trust. They accurately convey the scientific information. They don't suppress opposing opinion. They don't demonize other people who don't necessarily agree with you. I think all those things have been done in this epidemic to the detriment of public health, actually the detriment of all of us. I'm generally, actually, believe it or not, an optimistic person. I think we can get back to, otherwise I wouldn't have worked on this declaration.
And I think that another source of mischief here has been the extent to which many were prepared to place physicians in charge of national policy. And while physicians are certainly authorities as it relates to healthcare, there's a reason that they are working as a physician and others are elected to be leaders, political leaders. And I think that there's a danger whenever someone looks in isolation at just these direct medical consequences and dispenses advice as a doctor would dispense advice to 200 to 320 million patients. And I think that those leaders who are prepared to submit or acquiesce entirely to that prescription of the doctor to 320 million patients, jeopardizes all of us, because what they're saying is that we're prepared to disregard all those other factors that we are to consider in our role as leaders, as political, governmental leaders, and including the economy and including jobs and all those things that are as important and many of which result in health implications. Rather than stand up for those, they tend to delegate that authority. And so I'm afraid that many people are simply asking doctors, such as Fauci, what we should do. And Fauci, with the best of intentions, I'm sure, is giving the prescriptions that a physician would give. But that's not what a president or Congress, that's not what we want them to do. We want them to make the right policy considering all relevant factors.
This is why we opened up the Great Barrington Declaration to the public at large. I mean, I'm more proud of the fact that we have over 500,000 regular people signing on to this than I am about the tens of thousands of scientists and doctors that signed on. This is not only a medical decision. It's not only a public health decision. This is a very personal decision to every single human on the planet, actually, whose lives, every single person on Earth has been affected by this epidemic. Everyone should have a voice in what happens to them. And when we look to one leader or even one science at large to make those decisions, science is not capable of making those kinds of decisions for everybody. I'll just give you one very concrete example, right? So this actually didn't happen, but I thought about it. It's like I have a 19-year-old daughter. 2 years from now, she's going to graduate from college. Imagine the epidemic had hit and she was graduating from college this year, and the college decides to hold a graduation event, and my 80-year-old mom wants to attend. I tell her, look, there's a 5% chance of dying if you attend, if you get sick from this. Now, there's not a 100% chance you'll get sick, but there's some chance you might get sick, and then if you do get sick, there's a 5% chance of dying. And she tells me, you know what? I've been looking forward to my granddaughter's graduation for 20 years or 21 years. I want to take that risk. Mm-hmm. There's no person on earth that has the right to tell her not to do that. That's her choice.
Sure.
I can tell her, are you sure, Mom? I mean, we can take pictures for you. And she says, no, I need to be there. I mean, I mean, that's a family conversation. That's a personal thought informed by the facts. It's not the role of Dr. Fauci or me or anyone else to tell anyone what to do in that situation.
That's right. Where's she going to school?
Oh, my daughter actually goes to Stanford. She's
that figures.
Junior this year.
Is she going to go to medical school?
No, she's not going to med school. No.
No, I hear you completely. And the same thing could be said for, I mean, my heart goes out as an entrepreneur. My heart goes out to all these restaurant owners especially, but you can look at the hardest hit sectors, such as, in addition to restaurants, would be hotels and travel. And people who had spent decades building a business that, if you'd asked them in December, they would have said that they intend to, this would, be their legacy to their children. Family businesses, especially restaurants, are famous for that. And now we know that, what did I read? In New York City, 50% of the restaurants are gone forever, meaning they've actually closed their doors. And it's just in huge numbers also elsewhere. And to have somebody making decisions in Washington or even in a governor's mansion that disregards those economic consequences, I just think, and I think that you agree, is just failing to see the big picture.
Yeah, I think those are. I mean, I think in some sense, the lockdown policy that's been put in place in most states is the biggest assault on the working class and on the middle class in a generation.
And you refer to the money. It doesn't just represent money; it represents the people.
Yeah, it's lives, right? These are. You're talking about livelihoods. What people put their value, like what they've spent their lives trying to build. Those have meaning too. I think I've been a little reluctant to talk about that, partly because it's very easy for the other side to demonize me and others making arguments long I've made to say, look, all you care about is money. This is the lives at stake. But the point is that it's also lives at stake on the other side. Those lost livelihoods mean that people are poorer. They're less able to take care of their own health. When they face cancer, they're not going to have the resources to manage it. When they face inevitable health problems, they're going to be less capable of dealing with it. That's not just money, and of course, there's also the psychological harm that comes from losing everything you worked on for the entire life. Because of an arbitrary
the depression,
lockdown.
which often leads to suicide.
So I think there are health consequences of those, but even more, the question is what's the purpose in your life? What's the meaning for your life? And if you are unable, because of an arbitrary diktat, to say, look, I can't engage in my purpose, I can't engage my meaning, things that give my life meaning, then I think we've done something wrong. I mean, I think we want to account for the fact that this is a deadly virus, and we want to manage it carefully so that we don't expose people to undue risk. Absolutely. We want to sort of have public health can't just be about infection management or infection control. It has to be about human flourishing, human well-being. It has to account for all of this, all the things that people value in their health and their lives when it's making decisions and recommendations. What it has turned into is simply a way to try to minimize COVID spread, and actually hasn't done a very good job at that either. I think we need a change in policy, a fundamental rethinking.
Doctor, do you believe that the Declaration will have enough of an influence to foster change in terms of how we deal with this pandemic?
I sure hope so. I mean, it seems like it's generated an enormous response from the public at large, and also from tens of thousands of scientists. At the very least, it's undermined this idea that the scientists speaking with one voice. Oh, we must do a lockdown, or else the world will end. I mean, science is not saying that. It's very clear that the scientific community is in some sense divided. Dr. Fauci is not the only scientific voice in the United States. And there are many scientific voices that argue for a policy very different than the one that Dr. Fauci has put forward.
And to date, how many have signed the Declaration?
At last, I don't refresh my browser to check every minute. But let's say I think it's on the order of 10,000 scientists and 30,000 doctors, and I think it's over 600,000 regular folks.
So anyone can sign this, correct?
Yeah, anyone can sign it.
But here's what I wonder about. I wonder how many people from academia these are the most, for those who don't know this, the most influential voices in the medical profession are those who occupy positions as professors at the elite medical schools. And I have to ask you in conjunction with that question, have you had any pushback, any demonstrations, any consequences to you professionally for taking this position?
Oh, it's been tough here. There's a lot of folks at Stanford that don't agree with me. There's also people at Stanford who do agree with me too. So other professors of medicine. The Stanford Daily, which is the student newspaper, just did a cartoon of me displaying me as some sort of murderer. I mean, it's been sick and disgusting in some ways. But I mean, I don't. I have a responsibility to say what I'm seeing in the data. My job is not just about my, living a comfortable life as a professor. I have to say what I believe is true for public health at large, and that's the purpose of my job. So those are minor things to me relative to what's happening in the world.
Yeah, and good thing that you are already tenured.
Yeah, that helps some. But President's advisor is this Dr. Scott Atlas, who's actually, I knew him some before the epidemic, but I've become friends with him since. And 107 of my colleagues and friends wrote a letter very unfairly attacking him. In part, I mean, I don't want to impute motives, but I'll say that what they did is they mischaracterized his views and called him, in effect, a pseudoscientist, which is really unfair. I mean, he's a very prominent doctor, long-term member of the Stanford community, providing his best policy advice in a difficult situation to the president of the United States. I mean, they could give him constructive feedback, but to attack him directly in that way, I thought was really not constructive. And it's led to it's really difficult around Stanford to talk about this in any way without getting sort of unfairly attacked. I've actually had more luck in other places. I got an invitation from Johns Hopkins to participate in a panel. As I said, I met with folks from Harvard and Oxford to put this declaration together, and I've gotten lots and lots of encouraging messages from people in prominent academic institutions around the world who are starting to speak up.
Well, we're talking with Dr. J. Bhattacharya, who is a professor of medicine at Stanford and is a co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration. We're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I wanted to, comment a little farther afield than the direct subject of this interview, which is about your participation in and the message of the Great Barrington Declaration. And it's just irresistible as you talk about this effort to protest or to decry what you've said in this very scholarly and broadly supported declaration about how we should handle as public policy this pandemic. I think, Doctor, as I was talking last night, as you were talking, brought to mind a conversation I was having with someone who is a faculty member at Washington University, which WashU is here in St. Louis, and he was telling me about some of the issues he had seen, and in fact, one I think involved an incident with a professor there at your law school who had made a statement that was innocent, but what he had said was controversial, and it probably was inappropriate, which case he apologized. Not mean-spirited, just poor judgment. What this professor said to me when I said to him, I said, what is it about these professors that will not, that they've lost all their respect for freedom of expression, things for which liberals, probably the single most defining characteristic of liberalism, even as we use the word today, liberalism, not classical liberalism, but modern liberals. It seemed that one of their signal virtues or defining qualities was their insistence on civil liberties. So the ACLU, and you always respected them for that. Though my audience knows this, I would lean to the right. Still, I respected the left for that single fact that I always thought that they were very big on civil liberties. And it turns out that they were big on civil liberties when they were a minority. And now that that's not the case, I never cease to be amazed in various arenas, including this one we're talking about today, where it's no respect for freedom of speech. And in fact, it's much more than that. It's an absolute intolerance. And they don't see this, meaning these people who consider them good civil libertarians, I think they would say of themselves, or they would say that they hold up such values, and they literally do not see where when you publish something that they disagree with, you're either a very dishonest person or an incredibly stupid person. And there's no other explanation.
Yeah, a lot of character assassination.
Yeah, it's one of those two possibilities. There is no other possibility, such as the fact that maybe you're right. So I see this not just in healthcare, but I was thinking about this conversation I was having last night. One thing that this professor said to me was, he said, well, Joe, he said, interestingly enough, he said that the professors are not as bad as the students. He says that much of the grief that professors get in an academic environment for saying certain things, he says it's much worse from students than from faculty members, who he finds the faculty members push back, which is some of what I said anyway, but he doesn't find it as aggressive, and he finds it even tolerable. But the students, would drive if they had the power, would drive a faculty member off the campus, and they do drive guest speakers off the campuses. So this is a little bit afield of our purpose today, but it does tie in with the fact that you've taken a position that's contrary to that, I think, of the majority of academia.
Yeah, so I mean, I have seen some of this illiberal kind of. And it's shocking to me. Like this is a university. I mean, if we can't speak, we can't work. So I think that is really unfortunate. Let me try to make it make it a little more constructive than that, though, if I can.
Please.
At play here are two different norms because there's overlapping but not exactly equal kinds of fields here. There's science and there's public health. In science, if you cannot speak, science is dead, right? If I believe A and you believe B, we have to tell each other A and B. I believe A, you believe B, and then we work together to figure out an experiment to resolve, and we both end up believing C, right? Mm-hmm. That's science, right?
Yes.
And if you
Makes
can't
sense.
say B, then I just say A, and whatever you say about B is dangerous. We'll never arrive at C, which is closer to the truth than either A or B. So there's a norm in science of absolute commitment to this sort of freedom of inquiry that I think has been violated in the coronavirus environment, not just in the United States, by the way, in many places worldwide. There's another norm, the public health norm. There has to be some kind of unified messaging. If you don't have a unified messaging, it'll be difficult to get across what the information is. It's hard enough to get it across to the public at large so that people can know sort of what to do. When you have dissent in public health, that's seen as a little bit suspect, right? So if you're saying masks are good and someone says, no, masks, the evidence says masks are not good, well, okay, then you're going to have a fight. And that's a failure in public health. You shouldn't be having a fight in public. You should be saying, here's what the science says. The problem is that the coronavirus is a new virus. It's only 10 months old at this point, or in the United States anyways. It's a new virus, and the science is still evolving. To apply the norms of unified messaging from public health to the scientific discussion about what the right thing to do is, and much less the policy discussion about how to manage the virus from a policy point of view, there has to be open discussion as well. So like every time someone says something that's contrary to the conventional wisdom, what ends up happening is they get accused of saying dangerous things, and they get suppressed. And it feeds into what you were talking about, the sort of illiberal sentiment that's present in a lot of universities, including Stanford to some extent. It just amplifies that sort of negative phenomenon where you suppress legitimate scientific inquiry, legitimate policy debate in the name of what you're saying is too dangerous. I think that has to change.
Looking specifically at that point, I guess as we assemble the data, the demographic data and population data of various countries' different approaches, maybe that will end up allowing us to in retrospect decide what was the right thing and perhaps be prepared should this thing come sooner than another 100 years. And South Korea, well, thinking of those varying results, South Korea seems to have just done marvelously well. You just wonder how did they seem to quash this thing so efficiently?
Yeah, what do you make of that?
I mean, I think a lot of the Asian countries did well. I mean, there's a couple of things going on there. One, I think, is that it seems like there's probably some pre-existing immunity to the virus at higher rates in many of the Asian countries. Vietnam did well, Japan did well, South Korea did well, as you said. Singapore did well. I think so. There's something to that. The other thing is, I think some places, like New Zealand is a good example. They actually were very fortunate in some sense. They caught the virus very, very early before it spread through the population. So the standard test, trace, and isolate, test, contact, trace, and isolate, that paradigm could work if it's caught early enough, if the virus is caught early enough, and if there's a lot of pre-existing immunity, or if you can actually, that might work. The problem is, like all of Europe and the United States and Latin America did not have those features. It's very clear that we had less of this pre-existing immunity to the virus, and we had less, and we caught it even though we knew of the cases in January. In some sense, it was already kind of widespread. I did a study of how widespread it was in April, and it turns out that in Santa Clara County and in LA County, it was like 40 to 50 times more widespread than we had thought just by looking at cases in April. It was already too late to have a South Korea-like policy, even if we started in January, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I saw a video that you did. Probably it was an interview with whom I don't remember, but this has been a good 6 months ago. And I think it was you, tell me if it was, that you were speculating that, in fact, that the transmission rate you thought was going to be much lower than was guessed at the time, which was like 3, 4, 5% of the population is vulnerable to it. And you were thinking that really the transmission rate is going to be much lower. And that
actually, my hypothesis I thought it was going to be that the virus had already spread more widely than it. So what I did is a study to see how widespread the virus actually, how many people had been infected in early April, and it turns out that I thought it would be 500 times the number of cases, but it turned out to be about 50 times the number of cases. So, although I was wrong about how widespread it was, the 500, the 50 was still a huge multiple. So, just to give it to concrete example, so there were 1,000 cases in Santa Clara County, California, on April 3rd or 4th that the public health authorities had picked up, where they tested somebody and it turns out they had the virus. The study I did implied that there were actually 50,000 cases on that same date, with 49,000 of the infections not picked up by public health. That meant the virus was much less deadly, 50 times less deadly than if you just look at the death rate among the people who actually who had been identified as cases. And that's turned out to be true all over the world, actually. There's 50 studies like this, literally more than 50 studies, and they find those are the numbers I gave you at the beginning of the show about the survival rate for the virus, 99.8%.
Yeah, and you worded it real well because I remember you said, well, we know what the denominator is. We're trying to determine what the mortality rate is. You said, well, we know for sure what the denominator is, but what we don't know we know what the numerator is, I'm sorry. We know what the numerator is, but what we don't know is what the denominator is, meaning how many people have in fact had the virus. And I thought that expressed it really well, what the challenge was, is to figure out how many people were not symptomatic or, just got it and moved on and were unnoted.
That's a basic fact, right? I didn't know the number. No one knew the number then. It's really hard to make policy when you don't have that basic fact.
Right, when you don't have all the information.
Yeah, so you can forgive policymakers and public health folks and scientists for arguing for policy that tries to cope with the fact that we don't know that basic fact. Now we know a lot more about the virus than we did then, and yet we still have a March-like policy. It's time to change the policy now, given what we've learned about the virus in the last 7 months.
Yeah. You were on the show of the guy at Stanford who does this series.
Peter Robinson, yeah.
Pardon?
Peter Robinson, Uncommon Knowledge. I think.
Yes, Uncommon Knowledge. Yeah, it's funny I didn't associate, when we had you on today, I didn't associate you with that interview, but as you were talking, then I realized that you were the one who was making those statements at the time, which turned out to be correct.
I'm a little afraid to go back and look because who knows what I said then. 7 months is a long time.
Now, Doctor, if someone wanted to read more about the Great Barrington Declaration, it's online?
It is. You can go to gbdeclaration.org, and if you read it, there's a few frequently asked questions, and if you agree, please sign.
I didn't know that just anybody can sign it. I thought that its real power, and I believe that its real power is, and you noted this number separately at 10,000, would be the number of scientists, and 10,000, 40,000, I think. And the number of scientists.
30,000 doctors, 10,000 scientists, and I think almost 600,000.
So we can sign. We can be included with those brilliant scientists and doctors.
Yeah. But Jill, no offense intended, but I'm less concerned about your support than I am about somebody like Bhattacharya's. So I still think that the most important thing is the signatures you have from experts.
Absolutely.
And people don't know this.
I think people are starting to speak up because it's not true that all the scientists agree with let's say Dr. Fauci. I mean, it's just not. That's not the case. That the right policy is what he's suggesting. So yeah, I think that please take a look and see if you agree. I hope I made the case for it.
Tell me again your area of specialization at Stanford.
So I have an MD and a PhD in economics. I have spent the last 20 years writing on infectious disease policy, on health policy generally. I work on sort of at the intersection of epidemiology, health policy, health economics, on a million different topics. Of course, the last 7 months just on COVID, but So, for instance, I worked on the H1N1 flu epidemic from 2009. But one of my very first papers was on HIV policy. I've been thinking about infectious disease policy for a very long time.
Wow, this is right down your alley. And you don't find many doctors that know anything about economics of any sort.
It's a nice mix, actually. It turns out to be really useful in an epidemic. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, economics, some would say that if there's a single science, social science, that's most helpful in running the world or running a government, some would say economics above sociology.
Don't put us economists in charge either. We got it. I like the democracy for a reason, but it is helpful when you're thinking about trade-offs, which is what this policy should be deeply thinking about.
I can see that. So no, I think that's a powerful combination. Well, we certainly appreciate your time, and
we'd love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, maybe when we get further along here, and hopefully this is in our rearview mirror, you can make some comments in retrospect. I know you're very busy. So maybe we can circle back in another 6 months or so and squeeze into your schedule.
Oh, I really enjoyed talking with you both. You guys are fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Dr. J. Bhattacharya, Professor of Medicine, Stanford University. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, this has been another episode of Elder Talk. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Elder Talk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future, with attorney CPA Joe Cordell. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Listen again next Saturday for another edition of Elder Talk with TuckerAllen. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.